thank you to our super panelists, and I'm going to invite the next group of panelists to join me. What do we call this on the stage? Mr. Oleksiy Arestovych, former advisor to the office of the President of Ukraine, who I hope is here. Good. Pleasure to meet you. Wherever you like, I think. The Honorary Roderich Kiesewetter, member of the German Parliament. Dr. Benedetta Berti, Head of Policy Planning in the Office of the Secretary General, NATO. The Honorary Ivan Lewis, former UK Shadow Secretary of State, the Labour Party, CEO of the Focus Foundation, CEO of IL Associates UK. And Dr. Emmanuel Navon, CEO of the European Leadership Network, ELNET. Okay, so we're going to move on. I want to kind of start with you. We talked a little bit in the last panel about President Zelensky, the leadership role, the personality, but you presumably have lots of inside wisdom on this extraordinary individual who, I don't know, is it an exaggeration to say, who kind of galvanized and held the country together? You worked with him very closely until just a few months ago, right?
Yes, and what is the question?
Tell us about how he operates, what the strains upon him, how he's managing.
He dramatically changed from the previous wartime for this time. He changed just for the 1 month of the Kiev was surrounded by Russians and the war was starting. And I never seen the person who changed so dramatically for this short of time. One exception, it was the Chancellor Scholz, which came to the Bucha, and he entered Bucha one person, and after 3 hours he came out completely another person. And after that, we see the German policy dramatically changed for Ukrainian side and anti-Mr. Putin side. But President moved from the step to step, and first my thinking when I see him just in the morning of the 24th, it was just how he can manage with all of this weight of the war. And he managed completely incredible. He collect all symbolic capital from Ukrainians on himself. He doing like a head of the commanders. And he getting be a person who could make very offensive decision, not defensive decision, not thinking about how we can avoid some problems or something like this, just offensive decisions. He completely changed the manner of decision making. And now he managed Ukraine, all armed forces, our diplomacy, our country, like a very strong and strictly leader.
And is certain that Ukraine will prevail, that Russia will be forced back completely, that the world... I mean, he's been disappointed with some of the support he's had internationally, but broadly speaking, he feels support is growing, that things are moving in Ukraine's favor?
Last polls in Ukraine shows us that 87% of Ukrainians thinking about pulling Russia out just for the last soldier. And it's... I don't remember in the democracy of history of democracy country, so United Nations and government. It's all Ukrainians thinking about one thing, to pull out Russia again, because every time, every minute where Russians stand on our territory, it's a new butchers. We found in Kherson the prison for the the children, which is eldest was 14, and previous was 11. The total our children, and that's 11 prisoners in Kherson. We found in Izum 2 more big graves of our victims, and the first grave, it was, I could be mistaken, but it's about more than 400 victims. Only 8 of them was adult men. It was children, adults, and women. And we found right now 2 more, but it's mined from Russians, and we can't start to grow out, the grade out. It's a terrible thing. Where is the Russians staying? If we if we fight with the European countries, it's for the European rules, it could be negotiations. Now we're thinking no negotiations with Russia because they use our people, they collect our people, they conscript our people and use it against us. And from Donetsk and Lugansk region, it's about more than 60,000 killing people. It's our Ukrainian citizens. The Russians use it against us. Right. They tattoo our people. They take our goods and our things, and it's completely like the Mongols in 13th century. It's absolutely the same way. We can't leave any one soldier on our territory because it means they will kill and torture our people. That's why this is a problem.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Roderich, about you had a mention there about a radical shift in German attitudes. Maybe tell us about the evolution of German thinking on this war and Germany's response to it.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to ELNET and to Amos Gilad. I'm really delighted and grateful for the question. Why? In our caucus, CDU-CSU, in 2014 and 15, we had a dissent amongst the security politicians and those who are addicted to economy. And at that time, the German answer to the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the occupation of Crimea was Nord Stream 2. And I was an opposite of that. But it wasn't the majority. So the changing shifted also due to some members of parliament and in the German political environment who constantly mentioned this mistake and the increasing dependency from Germany of Russian gas, oil, and coal. So this changed only in the beginning of the war, when the Chancellor spoke his famous speech regarding the shift of time there. And I believe the German public was much more progressive than the majority in the parliament. And then, after the speech, also in the parliament, things moved. And in the end of April, we had a vast majority, nearly 600 out of 720 members of parliament, voted for a very clear support, not only in the civilian and psychological medical area, but also for heavy weapons for Ukraine. But the government did not exploit it. So we were witnesses of nearly 6 to 7 months of a kind of break inside the German domestic policy, whereas the opposition and the Greens, opposition CDU and the Greens, supported more effort. The Chancellery made a kind of breaking, or kind of using brakes, better to say, regarding the planning, industrial planning for the preparation of the armament support and production, and the planning of the delivery of heavy weapons. So this changed then in January tremendously, and now we are really one of those supporters who are not only speaking, who are also delivering. And I believe this needs a change in the mindset, but also it was a result not only of domestic pressure, but also by neighbor countries who were very convincing to support a stronger German endeavor in this issue.
Thank you. Benedetta, I want to come to you. We talked in the last panel, we had representatives from 2 countries, one of which has just joined NATO, one of which is about to join NATO. NATO, I mean, Ukraine is not a NATO member. The alliance did not apply. Nonetheless, give us a sense of whether NATO feels that it failed to deter Putin, or is that an unrealistic question? Is he deterred from further expansionist ambition? Is NATO actually strengthened and given greater purpose by the war in Ukraine?
Okay, easy question. Let me try to make a few points, starting with your latter question, which is what is NATO thinking? And I would say that from a NATO perspective, the real wake-up call for the alliance came in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea, meaning that from our military planning perspective, that's when the penny dropped, that some of the post-Cold War assumptions about security, defense, the notion that the Euro-Atlantic area was essentially an area of stability, peace, one where you didn't have to invest as much in the territorial defense of allies, those assumptions were invalidated in 2014. And that's why I joined NATO working for the Secretary General in 2017. And what I found was an alliance in the midst of the deepest military adaptation since the end of the Cold War, exactly to rebuild our ability to do deterrence and defense, to rebuild our ability to do territorial defense of Europe. So a series of decisions that were instrumental, I think, over the last year were actually taken after 2014. The decision to increase defense spending, which remains essential. You cannot deter and defend convincingly if you do not have the means, if you do not have the capabilities. So the commitment to spend 2% in defense was actually a direct result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2014. The rebuilding of our forward presence, which led after Russia's new culmination of this war in February 2022 to go from 4 battle groups on our eastern flank to 8, and to really thicken our eastern flank with air defenses, pre-positioned equipment, more troops stationed to send a clear signal of deterrence and defense. So there's much I could say, but the bottom line is the beginning of the military transformation that is being so essential, and it's really, I think, an historical shift, not just for NATO as an alliance, but for the transatlantic community, and even more for Europe. Again, this shift of mindset: security is not assured, peace is not assured, you have to invest in defense. All of that started in 2014. So in that sense, I do think there was a lot in place. And had those decisions not been taken and the military adaptation not had started, there is no way that after February 2022, NATO could have activated its defense plans within hours, or deployed 30,000 troops within days. All of this was work that had been done before. That said, I think there's no question that for the broader public, the February 2022 was when the penny finally dropped. The post-Cold War era peace dividend is over for us, and we really need to step up to the plate. Your question about is this a failure of deterrence? I think we can all have different answers. My personal 2 cents is that there's a lot that we need to reflect upon. First of all, in terms of taking potential authoritarian competitors seriously when they tell us what they plan to do. President Putin had not been shy about his designs. You could go back to his 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference and read it word for word. He told us, I do not believe in the post-Cold War security arrangement. It doesn't work for me. I want my sphere of influence back. He told us what he was going to do. Could we have taken that more seriously as a transatlantic community, as international community? I think so. It's a lesson. Hopefully, it's a lessons learned. Take authoritarian competitors more seriously. Do not try to appease those who understand strength and force, but try to be resolute. And I think another lesson that we're learning is do not create one-sided strategic dependencies on those actors. And we're learning that when it comes to our one-sided dependency on Russian oil and gas, which we are bringing a fast halt to, but maybe projecting into the future, let's think about one-sided dependencies on the PRC, for example, so that we don't sleepwalk from one dependency to another. So there's a lot that we can learn, not as NATO exclusively, but as the transatlantic community, or as, dare I say, as the political West.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, I want to come to you. And just ask you, first of all, I guess from a British perspective, Britain post-Brexit, Europe grappling with a war, how has Britain's exit from the EU affected its capacity to be at the heart of what's playing out here? Is there something particular and British about the response to the invasion?
I'm not sure. I ought to say, I think, before, to clarify in terms of what Carl said, I have no connection with Ivan the Terrible, by the way, before we go any further. I think the serious answer is that Britain was pretty first to show its support for Ukraine. Boris Johnson, for all his critics, was absolutely clear from the beginning. People can be cynical about the domestic challenges he had at the time, but Britain was exceptionally clear about where it stood from the beginning. I think, to be fair, the EU was too. I think the debate in Britain that's quite complex is how do you disentangle the cost of living crisis, the inflation, the economic challenges that we face? How do we disentangle the effect of the pandemic, Ukraine from leaving the European Union. It's quite a difficult debate to be had. So I think that's the impact in terms of the UK. In terms of some of the other comments that have been made, I think it's really important to try and analyse how we got here, which is what you were saying earlier. I mean, it seems to me that when the West is weak, it sends a signal to rogue leaders that there is an opportunity to take advantage. I don't think it's that complicated. We had, starting with President Obama, a retreat from the world. That continued under Trump. We then saw Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, not the fact that America withdrew, but the way that America withdrew. That sent messages time and time again of weakness. And it seems to me if Putin is looking rationally and objectively at the likely reaction from the West, he's got a reaction he never expected, if you look at that empirical evidence. So I think that in itself is a very, very important lesson. I think that if you look at moral clarity, rules-based world order, often that hasn't been applied to a superpower because we've been scared of the consequences. So we said, here's all the rules, here's all the moral norms that we believe are appropriate in terms of aggression, in terms of human rights, but there's going to be exemptions with countries that, frankly, are too powerful. So we've demonstrated in this set of circumstances that is not the case. And I think there are, major wider implications. If you look at China and Taiwan, we know the noises that China are making, but I suspect the way that the West has reacted, the way the European Union, NATO has reacted in such a unified, strong and clear way, will make the Chinese think perhaps differently than they would have thought if that hadn't have happened. Nobody's mentioned the fact that, frankly, the Biden administration was very keen to accelerate progress towards an Iran nuclear deal. The only reason that progress has halted is the alliance that Russia and Iran have formed in relation to Ukraine. And in my view, that's a really good thing, by the way. There will be different opinions in this room. But there's absolutely no doubt that there was every possibility. At the end of the day, Russia was actually being used as our main proxy, the West's main proxy, to try and get Iran to sign up to that nuclear deal, which I think some people in this room would regard as being flawed. So there are major wider implications. And I would also say that leadership is a very important issue here, because if you look at the challenges the world faces, I would argue for generations who never went through the last World War, the challenges we face are more complex and concerning than they've been for generations. And in that space, you need great leadership, not average leadership, not bog standard leadership, but great leadership. And I think it's only fair to say, if you look objectively at the quality of leaders around the world, Zelensky really is the only leader, I certainly feel, that one can respect. We can all talk about the pros and cons of different leaders around the world, but if we're talking about truly great leadership facing up to the great contemporary challenges, I think there is only one leader. And that, by the way, should cause us a great deal of concern. It's not necessarily something that should be a source of celebration. But Zelensky has really, in that sense, shown us what leadership should be all about.
Thank you. I mean, some of that you were discussing with me before. I want to come on, Emmanuel, partly in the context of what Ivan said, and also a little of what Benedetta said about taking seriously powerful people who issue threats. So we haven't talked much in this session about Israel, but Israel in the context of, hey, Russia threatened, Russia acted. Iran is threatening us. Changed attitudes to Iran, a will for appeasement in parts of the international community that has likely been staved off, certainly been impacted. Give us a little of the Israeli perspective.
Well, I don't know if there's one Israeli perspective, because as we know in Israel, there's always more than one opinion.
Honestly, I had no idea.
I had no idea about it, right? But I think that from Israel's perspective, what happened in Europe and what was described as by Chancellor Scholz as a Zeitenwende, a historical change, a new era, is something that definitely has impacted on Israel's relation with Europe, because it's a post-end of history Europe that totally takes into account the threat of war on its continent, the largest military conflict since the end of World War II. And now, of course, you have this military cooperation between Russia and Iran. Now, we also know that Russia is trying to undermine the US-led order that was partially implemented after World War II. Could not be fully implemented because of the Cold War and the competition between the US and the Soviet Union, and of course the fact that the Security Council was neutralized by the veto powers demanded by and obtained by Stalin. And this US-led order became possible only with the end of the Cold War. But today, Russia, I mean, it's been one of the objectives of Putin since he first came to power in 1999, and it started with the war in Chechnya, was to try to rebuild the Russian Empire. He's described the collapse of the Soviet Union as, quote unquote, the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And since the United States is Israel's strongest ally, this is of concern for Israel. Despite the fact that with the end of the Cold War, and especially with the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria, Israel has been able to build a relationship with Russia by which we coordinate our moves in the airspace of Syria. But it doesn't mean that the geopolitical interests of Israel and Russia don't clash. They do. And I think it's become clearer today. So in the beginning, as you know, Israel was a bit lukewarm about taking side in the war after Russia's aggression against Ukraine because of the fear of being blocked by Russia in the Syrian airspace. But I think that as Russia, increased the level and ferocity of its war crimes in Ukraine, as it upgraded its military cooperation with Iran, I think it's a no-brainer that obviously today I think Israel also has been increasing its support, its civilian support for Ukraine. And the last point is that Israel, we mentioned before NATO, right? As you know, a couple of years ago, President Macron of France described NATO as brain dead. So in our ELNET policy conference in Paris 2 weeks ago, we had a special panel on NATO. It was called From Brain Dead to No-Brainer. Right? So Putin, of course, has recreated, I would say, NATO, and this creates also new opportunities for Israel. As there is a need for security in Europe, Israel's military and intelligence expertise is in high demand, but also in terms of energy security. The mistake that has been made, and you mentioned before, of basically answering Putin's aggression in 2014 in Crimea by building Nord Stream 2, with what is called in German the Russlandversteher, those who understand Russia. I think everybody today in Germany understands this was a mistake. And this need to diversify Europe's natural gas imports also creates new opportunities for Israel. Remind you that an agreement was signed between the European Commission and Israel nearly a year ago for Israel to supply natural gas to the European Union. So I think this really opens new opportunities for Israel.
Thank you. Let me come to you in the context of lots of things that were said. So I'd like you to give us a Ukrainian perspective on how does Ukraine feel the international community has been performing, especially the United States. I'd be interested, China, and then give us a bit about Israel. So the former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt was sitting there in the last session. Israel was wavering. You kind of elaborated a little bit. I don't think Israel was wavering in terms of intuitive need to support, but there were certain geostrategic realities that Israel was grappling with. Anyway, I'm not trying to steer you. Tell me how it has looked from Kiev.
I can't speak for whole Kiev, but I can speak for myself, and I think the United States and collective West, probably collective West, now deciding very difficult task. It's to win Russia, Ukrainian arms, but win it this way, which is not pushed him finally under China.
To win, but not to push.
But not push it finally under the China, because China and Russia, like allies, is a more and more complicated problem for the West and the whole West, because China officially proclaimed it. The strategy West is fall and East is grow up in 2099. It is Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, all of them, all of China experts, spoken about this openly. About the West have to be fallen. West have to get into the regional power, not global power, and it is a, I don't know, what the ideological war which is proclaimed by China against collective West. It is a problem. In Russia, all of people in China say that NATO and collective West proclaimed China like a main threat, but it's not. China was first, and we now see like China doing. And Russia is the main problem between in United Nations and China tensions. And we think, and most of our shells was completely insufficient in the end of the March of previous year for the one month of the war. And first Rammstein started in the 26th of April. 3 months before July, when most of part of the Western shells came for our guns, our soldiers sitting 15 hours per day under the Russian shells. It was like a rain of shells, and they only on the part of the front line, which is near the Bakhmut, they using 60,000 shells per day, and all NATO produce 5 times more per year. And now the shells on the Bakhmut are probably 45,000 per day, And all our soldiers, all our people looking on this cruise missile, on this Iranian drones, on all of the shells, thinking what the West expected for. For what? What the West expected for F-16 or something like this. I'm an infantry officer. I'm a lieutenant colonel of Ukrainian army and fighting with Russia for 3 years. And now, a military person, I completely understand how much blood our infantry will spend for this counteroffensive without F-16. And main question for the West from us is where is the weapon? Because we are defend West here. If you know, if we remember, 2 or 3 months ago, Russia proclaimed they will increase the land forces for the 1.6 million personnel and created 18 new divisions for the 2026. For what reason? And we think the main challenge for us and for you, for collective West, is that Mr. Putin tried to get second Russian-Ukrainian war. It's probably have to be 2026, 2029. They completely prepare and they openly prepare and we have another thinking we have to prepare for this war. Yes.
I want to push you and I want to be sure I understand you because I think there's tremendous value in having you here and you're probably, particularly astute on what is actually playing out on the ground. What you're saying, if I understand, is some kind of protracted stalemate as Russia kind of reorganizes for many years to come? Is that what you're talking about?
Of course. It was first Chechen war, second Chechen war, and now they're preparing for second Russian-Ukrainian war. It's completely understandable. Completely understandable. And we make our strategical plan to thinking about this main goal. For us, Ukraine and collective West have to decide main task to contain Russia. Contain Russia and contain it from this day for 15 years in future. And when we're thinking on the West, and we spoke with Western authorities, Western journalists, experts, and something like this, the main reason I want to see in their eyes, do they understand that Russia preparing for second war with Ukraine? It's maybe not only with Ukraine, because Poland increased their army forces 3 times, not accidentally, yes, they completely understand what has happened. And when they spoke with the Eastern European country, with Great Britain, they completely understand us. When they spoke with the French, or when the Hungary, when the Italian, it's more difficult to understand us. Only our neighbors, which is historically knows what is Russia is, completely understand us. And we are preparing for next 10 or 15 years to contain Russia. And now we in Israel, and Arab states have to provide five conventional war against Israel before they understand Israel can't to be won by the military way, and ask how amount of the wars the Kremlin needs to understand Ukraine and West could be won by the conventional way. I don't think it will be one war. It's the main reason for us. We have two tasks: under post-war reconstruction and containing Russia for the years and years. And what we want from the West, to completely understandable, this is the main problem of the Eastern Europe and Europe policy. And but strategical frame, the highest frame, in this situation, just in the view of the United States and China tensions. And if Western authorities completely understand this, it will be more and more easier to contain Russia and to contain China both.
Thank you. Let me ask you to... So, how does that sound to you? Is there an underappreciation in the West of the long-term game plan of Russia and Putin? You didn't specify it, but the implication is the West should be doing much more. Ukraine is on the front line protecting Western interests and is not being supported sufficiently. You don't appreciate that this is, protracted conflict?
Well, as soon as threat becomes permanent, salvation also grows. But for this salvation, we need a change in our mindset. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the United Kingdom. Why? They were the catalyst of a new Europe for defense. They initiated the Tallinn Initiative together with Estonia, Poland, some Scandinavian states, which changed the attitude in Germany. And therefore, I believe that the new Europe during this war and after the war will be more defensive, more transatlantic, more cohesive, but also more northern and more eastern. And these countries who are very strong in the support of Ukraine will not be they will be reluctant to be guided by an axis of Paris and Berlin if they stay behind the necessary measures. So what we have to be faced with, and to be very clear and sober, yes, there will be a long war. If the West is not able, and other countries, to support Ukraine not as long as it takes, this is the wrong expression. They need to support Ukraine with as much as possible and legal inside the international law, and as soon as possible, and not as long as it takes. Because as long as it takes would mean a war of attrition, which our societies will not bear. They cannot withstand. We are not used to this. And therefore, I really plea for all in what is legally possible and what is economically feasible. Therefore, I see the need also to look to the timelines. One timeline is the beginning of the US elections. The second timeline is the European parliamentary elections next year on the 9th of June, 1 year ahead. And I see that populist parties would like to exploit this with an election of migration and threat, and also to find an armistice at any cost. We need to shape the time until these elections with a European Union with new perspective, to include Ukraine in due time in the European Union, to reform the European Union to be more receptible, and also to give a perspective to Ukraine to become NATO member. This would be the best security guarantee. Why so explicit? Because time is running out on us, and we need to support Ukraine more than we did in the past. So I'm very grateful that now long-range missiles and F-16 will help. But on the other side, it's not only military. We need to convince our societies. Just an example in the own house. Germany is investing more than 300 billion euros for societal cohesion. And in the same time, we spent 3 billion euros for Ukraine on military means. And by the end of this year, it will be 6 billion euros. But 50 times more we invest in our own societal cohesion. So there is a question of leadership to explain to the population, not only in Germany, also in other countries, except for Poland, United Kingdom, and the Baltic states, and Finland and Sweden, to explain we need to do more and we can afford to spend more to Ukraine, and because Russia wants to extend the war and they want to involve also Moldova. They want to press the Baltic states. They have the time and they say we have only the watch. So we must be much more outspoken. And also for Israel. Now Israel is shifting to CENTCOM and not to EUCOM. We should be much more open for Israel and their security concerns, and we have a little bit forgotten that the price for German unification was the readiness of our allies to defend Germany and Europe. And so our price today must be to promulgate security, also to be present in the Baltic states, to be on the side of the Americans with a fair burden sharing, to give them the opportunity to engage in the Indo-Pacific, because Russia is the tempest, but the real thunderstorm and the climate change is China. And therefore, we have to prepare ourselves to invest more in our neighborhood, together with Israel, and not to look and see how Iran might behave. This afternoon we will debate it. We need probably a preemptive strike or a preparatory strike against Iran to have more leeway. We have to work on Turkey because Turkey is exploiting the situation and destroying the cohesion between NATO and European Union. We will see this after the war and after the elections. So more investment from the European side and transatlantic endeavor, and in our populations that there will be a war of attrition if we don't invest more all in, to make it very brief.
Okay, you said an awful lot there very fast, which is a compliment. I just have to ask you one specific question. The preemptive strike on Iran, because that's kind of close to our hearts. Who's the we in your sentence? We need a preemptive strike on Iran.
We need to support... Please. Germany, at least. I cannot speak for my other European partner countries. But in 2011, Ehud Barak was in Germany and advertised and asked for support for a preemptive strike at that time. He asked, at least, he felt the temperature.
Backing for an Israeli preemptive strike.
He asked for backing. And there was complete denial, not only in Germany. And therefore, we have to learn, because our appeasement made Iran capable to pursue a way to become incalculable. And we cannot afford an alliance between Iran, China, and Russia with incalculable neighbors in this region. And therefore, we should gain time. And if there is no way via diplomacy to gain this time until they have the bomb, we need to shorten, we need to lengthen this by the application, surgical application of specific means. And we need to back this from Europe, because it's our security which is at stake.
Please.
Just one sentence. The weak Ukraine. It's a great temptation for Iran, for China, and for Russia to get in more and more through the years, to get in more allied, to attack Israel, attack collective West, attack Ukraine. Strong Ukraine with guarantees of own security. Ukraine in NATO, Ukraine in the European Union, is the ending of any temptation of Russia, China, and Iran together. On any dictators or authoritarian countries. They're looking forward, they're thinking about, it's the first time we was defeated, no problem, we're getting more and more, All Russian history, it's a history on the long wheel. Okay. They spent, just a moment, they spent 300 years to get in from the right side of the Dnieper to the left side of the Dnieper, and they will get in more and more efforts for winning Ukraine. After they win Ukraine, if they win Ukraine, the NATO face more and more threat than they have right now. Thank you.
Benedetta, I want to come to you in the context of, do you have a microphone? Yes. In the context of a mention of NATO going all in. I don't understand a need to maximize what is done to deter.
I didn't hear that. You would like to understand what does it mean to go all in?
I'm really interested to know what goes on within NATO? Are there member states within NATO that are pressing for NATO to be more engaged, more aggressive? Is there tension within NATO? That's what I'm asking.
Let me rephrase the question, so maybe we talk about the actual debate. Do we understand the stakes? Is there a discussion between the 31 allies within NATO about what the stakes are of the war, that is, of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine? And I would say the answer is a resounding yes. And you do see that in the transformation of assistance that has been given to Ukraine since February. Not only through NATO. NATO delivers non-lethal assistance. The lethal assistance is delivered through individual member states and for those who are members of the European Union, through the European Union. But if you look at the total amount of military, humanitarian, and financial assistance, over 150 billion in a year, these numbers speak, I think, volume with respect to the understanding of the stakes. And I mean, I don't want to repeat what has been said that, but the stakes are very clear. It's about, of course, first and foremost, it's about Ukraine and its right to exist as a sovereign, independent country. That's clear, but it's way beyond that, and we understand that. It's about the European security order. What are the rules that will govern whatever future European security order will emerge? Are we going to be able to live in an environment of stability, predictability, where we can where we don't have to spend as much and for as long on defense? Or will we be, and I think that's very much our understanding, going back to all the assumptions that have been made, we share those assumptions. If you read our new strategy that we just agreed a few months ago, this is about preparing for a war that is more volatile, where crises are permanent, where peace is not assured, where strategic competition is going to define and test us repeatedly from the kinetic to the non-kinetic. So it's preparing for this much more competitive and complex war. But a lot of how will that develop for us as Europe rests on the future of this conflict, of this war, and what happens in Ukraine. If Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent country, which I think is the only option, then we are witnessing a future in which we can think over time about rebuilding a European security order. Of course, the short-term task will be to ensure that Ukraine remains able to credibly deter and defend against any future threat of aggression, and that will include a discussion about security guarantees. Nobody is naive about that. We know that. But the point is, if that's not what awaits us, if Ukraine does not prevail as a sovereign, independent country, then what we're witnessing is a security architecture that is less stable, more volatile, where aggression will come again. Because if aggression is rewarded, of course it will come again. Why not? And where it's not just going to be about a European security order, it's going to be about the global rules-based international order, and we know Beijing is watching. So I think to answer your question, yes, we do understand those stakes very clearly, and I think the way we are changing our strategy, the way we're rebuilding our ability to do collective defense, the amount of assistance to Ukraine, from the humanitarian to the financial to the military, and the transformation of the military assistance from what was essentially taboo in February to discussing F-16. And I hear the point from Ukraine. Should have happened sooner. I understand that. If I was sitting in that chair and in those shoes, I would say the same. But from where I sit, that is a monumental shift in attitude that we're witnessing. And I am convinced that it's not a one winter shift in attitude. I'm convinced it's permanent, because I really do think that we understand what the stakes are. But it will take some time, especially for those countries in Europe that had for essentially 40 years hit the snooze button on defense. It's not going to happen overnight.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, I want to just briefly, we've got very little time, I just want to ask you, take advantage of the fact that you're from the Labour Party, which had a leadership that was extremely hostile to Israel. I could be much nastier, but I won't. Has that changed now? Is the UK's main opposition party moving closer to its traditional, certainly more sympathetic and understanding attitude to Israel?
I and many others left the Labour Party because of that institutional anti-Semitism created by a man who said he spent his whole life fighting racism, but then turned the party of anti-racism into the party of institutionalised anti-Semitism. Has that been largely sanitised? I think Starmer's done a good job. I think certainly in terms of influence over policy, the leadership of the party, the direction of the party, I think it's fair to say that a lot of those forces have been eliminated. I think, therefore, the question is, would the Jewish community need to be frightened at the prospect of the election of a Labour government in the United Kingdom? I would say that they wouldn't need to be frightened. But the real test is this, beyond that, and it's back to some of the discussions we've been having, David, if I may, very quickly. You know, there are two elements to this question for Jews and for Israel. You were a little bit edgy when people implied that Israel wasn't quick to support Ukraine. The truth is, Israel wasn't quick to support Ukraine. And it cited its own interests as reasoning for that. Well, that's why we cited being friends with the leaders of Hungary and Brazil in recent times, because they supported Israel. So we must have, as Israel and Jews, a moral compass. And that moral compass must have certain elements to it which are non-negotiable. And I don't think we should be afraid to say that in this room. But the second element of this, are the world going to apply double standards in terms of the threat that Israel faces from Iran? Because it's been said by our friend over here, unfortunately, it is indisputable that there is action is going to have to be taken against Iran in terms of not just their nuclear capacity, what they're doing in Lebanon and Syria, and the consequences of all of that. Israel and others are going to have to act against Iran. Now, is the European Union going to apply the same principles as they belatedly applied to supporting Ukraine?
I want to stop you because I want to put your question to Emmanuel. We're going to run out of time otherwise.
When Israel is required to take, and others are required to take that action.
Okay, so give us a take on that. We're out of time very quickly.
On what exactly?
On whether a double standard is going to apply, whether the case of Ukraine is changing attitudes to an Israel under threat by Iran. I'd also like you to get into whether Israel moving away from democracy might alienate some of its allies, but we're on -20 already. So whatever you can say briefly.
Okay, so I think that as I said before, there's a change of attitude of Europe, generally speaking, towards Israel because of the war in Ukraine. And this brings me also to what you mentioned. There was some temptation, I think, in the past, in recent years in Israel, to get closer to leaders such as Bolsonaro in Brazil or Orban in Hungary. And I think today we realize, for example, most people realize and understand that where Orban is standing when it comes to Russia. He's the biggest troublemaker in the EU and in NATO when it comes to Russia because he still clings to Putin. Bolsonaro, thankfully, is no longer around, but his attitude internationally was not exactly, I mean, he did help Israel fight Hezbollah in Latin America, but at the end of the day, I think today in Europe, we don't need to look for those kind of partners. We have enough countries in Europe that understand our security needs and also understand what Israel can bring to Europe in terms of our technology and Israel's added value in energy security. So this makes it easier, I would say, to lower the gap between realpolitik and our values, because I think that Europe today is on board to understand Israel's security needs and understand what Israel has to bring to Europe.
Okay, I really wanted you to carry on. I wanted all of you to carry on, but there's flashing lights, and I think we have to stop. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for being here. Wonderful panelists. Thank you.